Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier with my penultimate presentation on the Great Attacks, moving into 1917 and looking at Vimy Ridge and Chemin. Now my overriding questions remain. What was the thinking behind the strategy? What tactics were employed? How was technology being used? Did they show things had been learned? Why weren't they successful though? And what were the consequences? For Britain, for France, for Germany, and always looking ahead for the war as a whole. But given that these attacks took place a year later, I think we need to refocus a little and ask what new tactics were introduced to British and French tactics, and why was it still proving impossible to make that breakthrough. In a joint attack in April, the British and Canadians attacked Vimy Ridge at Arras as a diversion before the French attacked the Chemin Ridge on the River Ain in the Champagne province, which Nivelle, who had taken over as commander-in-chief of the French army, was convinced would lead to a decisive breakthrough. Preliminary artillery fire was at the heart of the plans for both assaults. The British artillery was a much more effective force than had been the case in the first assaults of 1915. They were much better trained and had plenty of guns, including the medium and heavy guns, and a new shell, though still in short supply, with a fuse primed to explode only on impact, which made clearing barbed wire much more efficient. They were also benefiting from air reconnaissance, as well as flash spotting and sound ranging, all of which helped the identification and accurate targeting of key enemy artillery positions. These were mapped out into zones, and as the battle unfolded, zone calls from spotters would direct artillery fire to where positions of strength still survived. As a result of all this, their confidence was high. Not only could they lay down different types of bombardment, but they could suppress German artillery fire during an attack, as well as making life very difficult when the German infantry counterattacked. What's more, almost 3,000 British guns faced barely 1,000 German guns. Because the new barbed wire busting shell was still in short supply, as were tanks, Haig opted for a prolonged bombardment. So there was a 4-day bombardment, targeting the German trenches, their artillery and strong points such as machine gun positions, as well as their command headquarters. This was followed by a creeping barrage as the infantry went over the top, consisting of a mixture of high explosive shells, shrapnel, gas, and smoke shells, whilst the Royal Flying Corps, that's the forerunner of the RAF, and spotters monitored the damage inflicted and any changes to German positions and made their zone calls. It worked very well. The infantry, who had been well trained for the assault and knew their role very well, moved forward in waves. As one tired, the next would take over. All of 6 kilometres was gained in the first day, and Vimy Ridge was taken. But when the infantry got beyond the range of their supporting artillery fire, the attack faltered. The artillery pushed forward, but they didn't have the time to set up communications and recalibrate, retarget their guns, and the Germans were able to reorganize themselves. A breakthrough was still proving impossible to implement. But the British still needed to divert the Germans' attention or at least their full attention, away from the French assault. This was still alliance warfare, and with the French assault failing in its unrealistic aims, a major breakthrough, and the French army mutinying, more of this in just a minute, the British had to maintain their own attack, even as it deteriorated into another war of attrition, and as casualty rates soared to around 150,000, with the average daily rate higher than the Somme had been. The Germans lost around 100,000 men. Nivel's tactics at Chemin was to use what had worked at Verdun, but on a much larger battlefield. The artillery would create narrow corridors through which the infantry would advance, ignoring German strongpoints, unless they were inflicting damage. Once they had taken the German lines, the heavy guns would be brought forward, and more infantry would be thrown into the fray to take out the strongpoints that had been bypassed and force a complete breakthrough. Surprise was supposed to be a key factor, but Nivelle had been bragging of his offensive to the press, whilst Germans had also gleaned vital intelligence from French deserters. The French attacked on a wide front, something like 50 kilometres, supported by more than 5,000 artillery pieces and tanks. But their artillery had been handicapped by the bad weather, which meant their planes couldn't fly, and the German guns were particularly well sheltered from the French fire. Whilst more than half of their 132 tanks were put out of action by German artillery or else broke down on the first day. In places the French did make gains, more than 6 kilometres in one area, as the Germans retreated from a line that was difficult to defend. And they did take Chemin Ridge. They also took more than 28,000 Germans prisoner and captured over 180 artillery pieces. But these were only isolated successes across a wide front, or in the case of the ridge, a minor success compared with what had been so confidently and loudly promised. And they came at a high price, over 130,000 French casualties in total, 30,000 killed, and there were serious mutinies amongst the French troops. These mutinies were serious, very serious. Men refused to obey their officers' orders. A total of 54 divisions were involved. The French were simply tired of the war. They had taken the brunt of the fighting, but for the Somme, and were at their wits' end. Nivelle had promised a major breakthrough, and though they had made more gains than had been the case since 1914, the war's end was still not in sight. They wanted the war to end, though this was not a pacifist-inspired mutiny. They had simply had enough of the slaughter, the fierce discipline, and the lack of leave. Promises of leave had repeatedly been broken. There were stirrings of unrest before the Chemin offensive, but the slaughter the French had just suffered tipped men over the edge. Though the mutinies were over by July, they had been serious, and their impact would continue for the rest of the year. Nivelle was dismissed as commander-in-chief and replaced by the other great hero of Verdun, General Pétain, with General Foch his chief of general staff. Pétain's first job was to deal with the mutinies, and he dealt sensibly with them. Out of more than 550 handed a death sentence, only somewhere between 40 to 60 were actually shot, and then he sensibly decided on a defensive policy, with the main body of men placed at least beyond the range of the German field guns, until the arrival of American forces which would make a fresh attack possible. There would be some minor French offensives before then, but artillery would be used to minimise casualties. So there you are. I trust you can see Vimy Ridge and Chemin, though not so well known, as being really important. Don't forget that if you think you might benefit from tutorials, all you have to do is get your parents to get in touch with me at historymadeeasier@gmail.com to see if we can sort something out. But for now, let me thank you for listening and wish you the very best of luck in your studies. Cheers.